The game begins with white playing pawn to c4, offering the gambit pawn. A very common mistake by black is accepting the gambit by capturing this pawn, which results in them giving up control of the center. Why is it problematic for black to capture this pawn? This misunderstanding arises frequently, so let me clarify. In general, during the opening phase, you want to develop your pieces, castle early, and establish control over the center squares, typically d4, d5, e4, and e5. By offering the pawn on c4 as bait, white aims to lure black away from the center. When black accepts the gambit, white successfully accomplishes their goal of dominating the center and achieving a better position early in the game. Black often fails to recognize the long-term consequences of capturing the gambit pawn. They might think, what's wrong with taking a free pawn? Even if white eventually recaptures it, it will just be an exchange of pawns. However, the real issue lies in the positional disadvantage black creates for themselves. By capturing the pawn on c4, black allows white to dominate the center. White can easily regain the pawn by playing pawn to e3, recovering it in the next move. For example, if black develops a piece, white simply captures the pawn, restoring material equality. Let's play out a few more moves to illustrate this. Black develops a piece, white follows suit, and soon it becomes evident that white has established a strong pawn in the center, controlling key squares and threatening to advance further. On the other hand, black has no pawns controlling the central squares, d4, d5, e4, e5. White successfully outmaneuvers black in establishing central control, which is why black should avoid giving up the center. Additionally, let me share a tactical idea often seen in such games. Many opponents may bring their bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3. In response, some of you might feel tempted to transform this into a dramatic queen's gambit by sacrificing your queen, allowing your opponent to take it. For example, you could set up a tactical trap with moves like bishop takes f7, delivering a checkmate after they capture your queen. This bold tactic can surprise an unsuspecting opponent and turn the game in your favor. Although the queen sacrifice may seem like a bold and creative idea, it doesn't work in this particular case. Instead of capturing the queen, black should capture the knight first and only then take the queen. So, how should white handle this situation differently instead of playing knight to e5? I call this the crook method. When your opponent moves right, you go left, exploiting their weaknesses. After black removes their bishop from the queenside, white can counter by moving the queen to target the weak pawn on f7, the pawn on b7, and the knight on c6. From this position, black is already on the defensive and will inevitably lose at least one of their pawns. If black tries to continue their attack with bishop takes f3, white doesn't need to recapture immediately. Instead, white has a stronger response, capturing the pawn on f7, checking the black king. After the king is forced to move, white plays queen to e6, delivering an unexpected and swift checkmate. In the previous example, black's defeat was the result of a tactical blunder, but it might not be obvious whether accepting the gambit pawn doesn't lose the game outright. It sets black on the wrong path, giving white a positional advantage. Now, let's see how the game can unfold if both sides focus on making solid, balanced moves. For instance, if both players develop their pieces cautiously and black plays safely, the game can progress in a more even manner. White develops their pieces, and at this point, black must figure out how to develop their light-squared bishop, which is currently blocked by the pawn on e6. Let's say black decides to fianchetto the bishop. This is the critical moment. White can immediately seize control of the center by advancing both pawns to d4 and e4, creating an ideal setup that every player should strive for in the opening. Now, if black develops their bishop to b7, it attacks the pawn on e4 twice. To counter this, white must develop and defend the pawn, for example, by moving the queen to e2. Black continues their development knight to d7. In this position, white can play rook to d1, placing it directly opposite black's queen, creating a bit of tension. This already makes black's position slightly uncomfortable. If black attempts to open up the center by playing c5, the resulting file alignment will leave their queen in a precarious position. If black moves the queen away to a safer square, white can respond with bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6 and creating additional threats, such as advancing the pawn to e5. Should black defend the bishop, white can bring their other rook into play, activating both rooks along open or semi-open files. By the early middle game, white achieves a strong position. They control a lot of space, their pieces are active, and their rooks dominate the central and key files. This setup puts black on the defensive and showcases the advantages of a well-played opening. White's bishops are active, controlling multiple diagonals, while their central pawns are ready to advance, enabling white to initiate an attack at any moment. In contrast, black's position is cramped, with their pieces stuck on the back ranks. Take a closer look at black's position. The knight on d7 is severely restricted, with all its potential squares covered. Its only possible move would be backward, which is unproductive. The bishop on b7 has limited mobility and isn't contributing to the game meaningfully. The knight on f6 has no active squares to occupy and can only move to the board's edge, which serves little purpose. This shows how dominating the center is a significant advantage. Controlling the center not only enhances your own piece activity but also severely limits your opponent's options. This is precisely why black should avoid giving up the center too easily. A common misconception about the queen's gambit is that it's a true gambit. However, the name is somewhat misleading because if black accepts the pawn, they cannot hold onto it. As we've seen earlier, white can simply play pawn to e3 and recapture the pawn on the next move. Black has no effective way to keep the pawn. If black tries to defend the pawn with bishop to e6, it's awkward because this blocks their e7 pawn, light squared bishop, and to some extent, their queen. White can then play knight to a3, adding a second attacker to the pawn, leaving black with very few options to defend it. If black instead tries to guard the pawn with pawn to b5, it leads to the classical queen's gambit trap. White plays pawn to a4, aiming to break up black's pawn chain. If black captures on a4, white can easily recover the pawn while activating their pieces and gaining a positional advantage. Even if black tries to reinforce their pawn chain with pawn to a6, it fails badly. After an exchange of pawns, black misses a crucial detail. The rook on a8 is left undefended. White can simply capture the rook and win the game outright. This demonstrates how fragile black's position becomes when they try too hard to hold onto the gambit pawn, turning it into a disadvantage instead of an asset. If black attempts to defend the b5 pawn with pawn to c6, white has a clever response. After exchanging pawns, white can play the sneaky move queen to f3, aiming to capture the rook on a8. Black is forced into a difficult position and must give up material to save the rook. Whether they sacrifice the rook, the knight, or the bishop, black will lose significant material, leaving white with a winning position. In the next example, black initially plays the correct move, pawn to e6, solidifying their center. Both sides develop their knights. But then black makes the mistake we discussed earlier, giving up the center. White responds with pawn to e3, preparing to recapture the gambit pawn. Black then follows up with another common mistake, knight to c6. This move is interesting because it's often recommended in other openings, even from the very beginning of the game. For beginner players, it may seem unclear why this move is incorrect in this context. Let's explore why knight to c6 doesn't work here and how it leads to problems for black. Let's analyze this position in detail. Suppose both sides continue developing their pieces, and white decides to occupy the center by playing pawn to e4. Black would ideally want to develop their dark squared bishop, but it's challenging. If they place the bishop on d7, it remains passive and has limited influence. If they fianchetto the bishop to b7 by playing pawn to b6 first, the bishop will still be blocked by the knight on c6. In all these scenarios, black would also like to play pawn to c5 to contest the center and put pressure on white's pawns. However, the knight on c6 obstructs this plan, making it difficult for black to coordinate their pieces. This misplaced knight ends up hindering the development of the bishop, the rook, and even the queen, while also preventing black from undermining white's central control effectively. So, what would have been the correct approach for black? Instead of rushing to develop the knight to c6, black should first play pawn to c5, striking at the center. Once the pawn is advanced, they can then develop the knight to c6. This sequence improves black's position significantly. The c5 pawn challenges white's central control by attacking the pawn on d4 3 times. Although white is currently defending the pawn successfully, they are now tied down to its defense. White cannot easily push the pawn to e4, as that would immediately lead to a blunder. White's queen is also restricted. Moving it away would result in the d4 pawn falling. If white decides to trade pawns on c5, this works to black's advantage. White would surrender their central dominance, leaving the position balanced and symmetrical, giving black a comfortable and comparable game.